Hello, my name is Caitlin Chadwick, and this is my presentation on the three interactive forces that we find inside the lover, known as race, class, and sex. And the book itself, that's based on the lover. It was written by Marguerite Donadot. Her famous pseudonym is also known as Marguerite Duras. And Duras was born on April 14, 1914 in Gian Dien, Cochin, which is modern-day Vietnam. She died in March 3, 1996 in Paris, France. And Duras' legacy is being celebrated as a French novelist, screenwriter, scene artist, playwright, and film director. And one of her most celebrated literary works is Le Mans. And Le Mans was published in 1984 when Duras herself was 70 years old. And during the same year of its publication, the book won the Le Prix Goncourt, which is one of France's most celebrated literary awards. And the book itself is based on semi-autobiographical information based on Duras' life, set in pre-World War II Indochina. And Le Mans is a clever reversal of the stereotypical colonial romance, and it recasts the much older European man as a young French white girl, and it recasts the much younger indigenous woman as a much older Chinese man. And these reversals of the stereotypical colonial romance really uncovers the hidden contradictions inside of the colonial system based upon race, class, and sex. And a few years after the book's initial release, Jean-Jacques Annaud, a celebrated French director, picked up the movie and he made it into The Lover in 1992. And this movie starred Jane March and Tony Leung as the main principal roles. And when it was first released, some critics argued that Le Mans was an appropriation, that the movie appropriated the original hybridity found inside Le Mans, and the film just wiped it out and remastered it into a colonial narrative like Gone with the Wind. However, I would argue that the critics failed to understand that the film's textual source did lack hybridity, like its cinematic comparison of Gone with the Wind, because both pieces of media prioritize the perspectives of a young white woman. And like Gone with the Wind, the female protagonist of The Lover is struggling with problems of her class, not race, because hybridity constitutes a struggle between two racial identities, and the young French girl is not struggling with her racial identity, because her racial identity of being young, white, and French is celebrated and accepted by the dominant culture. And the girl's proclaimed hatred for France is rather superficial, because her bitterness is rooted in the fact that her destitution bars her from attaining material success and privilege that the society promotes for Europeans to have naturally. And the title itself, The Lover, it does apply to the Chinese man who is pursuing a romantic and sexual relationship with a young white French girl. However, the lover also applies to the young white French girl herself, because she is not only the object to be desired, and she is also the lover who pursues the material wealth and status that the Chinese man promises her, and he buys her similar to a commodity. As we can see in the film, how white femininity is treated as a social capital, which is prized inside of a colonial system. And the film's costuming department really brings to life all of these contradictions and white femininity as a show of social capital, as seen through the three main components of the young white French girl's costume: her beige dress, her red lipstick, and the man's fedora. And the cinematography of The Lover first focuses on the young white French girl, particularly her red lips, because it adds to the fact that the audience is promoted to see her as a sexualized object. However, the girl shows some self-awareness in the fact that this is how a colonial society would perceive her, and it also represents her own desires to pursue wealth, status, and to have her own explorations of her own body and her own sexuality. However, this is strongly contrasted by her beige dress, which represents her tarnished white status due to her poverty and destitution. And although she craves to have the privileges of being a young white French girl, which she feels is being denied to her, however, the man's fedora is a subtle rejection of colonial standards for women during 1992, because a man's fedora was specifically reserved for men to wear. However, the young white French girl projects that she wants to be seen as capable, intelligent, ambitious, and hardworking, like any masculine quality. And these are the qualities that really draw the Chinese man to her in the first place, because, as he says in the film, Vietnamese women typically do not wear men's fedora caps because Vietnamese women represent the absolute bottom of the colonial system found in Vietnam, because they have the least opportunity to be seen as viable, beautiful women, along with they have the fewest economic opportunities for social advancement. However, the girl uses her qualities of being young, white, and French to help her social advancement inside of a colonial society. And the film really centers around the two colonial voices of the lover. Inside the lover, the interracial romance between the young white French girl and her much older Chinese man. However, the film does a huge disservice to the indigenous people of where the movie is set, Vietnam, because the film reinforces the colonial standard that the stories and the unique experiences of the Vietnamese people are not worth telling, because the film denies the Vietnamese people any meaningful character role, being leading or supporting, and meaningful dialogue along with meaningful action. However, the movie produces a version where the Vietnamese people are simply relegated to the background, where they're integrated into the very scenery of Vietnam itself, with the landscape and the Mekong River. And this can be seen with how their costuming is not meant to stand out. They're dressed in muted and earthy tones, so they're really meant to blend in with the landscape itself, unlike the white French girl, because her beige is a shade of brown. However, it's the absolute lightest shade of brown, so she stands out against much darker shades of brown and black that are used to costume the Vietnamese people. And the man's white suit just projects how he wants to be seen inside of a colonial society, of being absolute pristine and sophisticated, like how a white person is seen, a European white man is seen. However, his wealth and status cannot protect him from the racial discrimination found inside the colonial system, because his young white French lover and her destitute, poor family discriminate against him, so his wealth cannot protect him there. However, it provides him more advantages inside the colonial system that the Vietnamese people simply do not have, because the Chinese have traditionally been a colonial power inside of Vietnam, predating the French arriving in Vietnam. So he demonstrates, his character of the Chinese man demonstrates the complacency of generational wealth being built upon generation and generation of ruthless financial exploitation of the Vietnamese people. So therefore, overall, this whole film is more of a of a meditation about the role of money and status inside of a colonial system, rather than being a meaningful analysis and examination into the role of race and racial divisions inside of a colonial system. Thank you.
So hello everyone, my name is Marcos Lopez, and today I'm here to present my research titled Gender Perceptions Within Francophone Cultures. This project was mentored by Dr. Stacy Ayotte. Before we get into the specifics about the actual project and what I did, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between sex and gender. And so usually sex and gender are taken to be, synonyms for each other. But that's not really the case. Sex refers to the biological part of this, and it's basically genetic differences, hormones, and so forth. Whereas gender is mainly like the social constructs, so the things that we assign meaning to the roles, the behaviors of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. And so now going through this, there's certain kind of things that you have to adhere by. So to be masculine is to be emotionally controlled, strong, assertive. To be feminine is to be caring and show emotions to others and be able to, build relationships. But no matter what, gender, the things differ, what the meanings of it differ from culture to culture. But what remains the same are the fundamental principles of gender. And so there's 4. Gender is learned and enforced. That's the first one. And so essentially from an early age, you are basically forced to choose what kind of gender you're going to identify as, whether it's, a feminine gender or a masculine gender. And again, the social meanings and expectations vary from culture to culture. Non-Western cultures tend to view gender along a spectrum. And so you tend to see third gendered here. Also, non-binary tends to be prevalent here, and so that's kind of the non-Western. The second principle is that gender is collaborative, and so we learn from looking at the gender performances of others, whether that's our parents, other extended family members and friends. The third is that gender is performative, so gender does not occur in a vacuum. We learn and we mimic behaviors by role models. So like if a son would mimic the behaviors of his father and adopt those behaviors, whereas a daughter would likely mimic the behaviors of her mother. And so this is constructed through repeated performances. The last one is that gender is relational, in other words, asymmetrical. And this kind of results in some disparities and inequalities to rights, representations, and privileges afforded to both men and women. So becoming gendered. You become gendered at birth. It continues into early childhood, and then by the time you're an adult, you're kind of set in what gender you are. Gender socialization, it's really the process by which we learn to do gender. And we learn through agents of socialization. So the primary agents of socialization, the first ones you encounter are your parents. And the second agents of socialization tend to be, family members outside of your parents, friends that you have in elementary school and so forth, teachers, any other kind of role model you meet after. And so gender socialization is stricter for boys than it is girls. It's socially acceptable for a girl to have like a lot of masculine behaviors, a tomboy, but it's not socially acceptable for a boy to have very feminine behaviors. And so, gender stereotypes, now that we get into this, kind of tie back into that. So stereotypes, we all know what it is. It's performances that, basically what's right to do in terms of being a man and a woman, what you need to do. This can harm children's self-image, and this leads to greater inequalities. Women tend to have less professional opportunities available to them. Stereotypes in a personal context, women are judged based on their appearances, so how they dress, whereas men are judged based off their potential and all their accomplishments that they have made. A stereotypical male is emotionally controlled, aggressive, typically, and a stereotypical female is friendly, compassionate, and sensitive. And so the purpose of my research, I had three purposes. I'll focus primarily in this presentation on the first one, was to identify current views of gender within Francophone countries, Francophone cultures. And so the specific countries I looked at were France, Canada, Tunisia, and Morocco. The second purpose was to analyze the accuracy of interpersonal gender stereotypes. And the third was to examine gendered communication practices, so speech patterns, so either having a masculine communication style or a feminine communication style. Methodology, I did a total of 20 interviews within about 30 minutes each of them lasted. First, I did a series of demographic questions, and then I followed that by statements where I asked, gender identification, age, country of origin, and then I followed that up by doing some statements with interpersonal and nonverbal gender stereotypes. So an example, I would say, men tend to smile more than women, true or false, and then follow up with an explanation. I also did statements addressing characteristics of gendered speech, and then I had questions concerning perceptions of gender. So, for example, what does it mean to you growing up to be masculine or feminine in the 21st century? I had two criteria. Participants had to be at least 18 years old and originate from a Francophone country. So that's any country that had historical political ties now or in the past to France. And participants were recruited via convenient sampling, and all interviews were conducted on Talk Abroad and then transcribed. So demographic information, we had 8 participants from France, 4 from Canada. Overall, we had 13 females and 7 males. So when it came time to coming up with my results, I sat down and transcribed all the interviews, and keep in mind these were in French, and then found quotes that kind of fit to themes that I wanted to do, and I ensured that those themes were present through most of the interviews. And so for viewpoints related to the word gender, 2 common viewpoints were reoccurring in these interviews. So the first one was that gender corresponds to biological sex, and then that gender is a nuanced label, so it's like a spectrum. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each of these. So gender corresponding to biological sex. So here it's the belief that there are 2 sexes, male, female, and that corresponds to 2 genders, being a man or being a woman. You develop a gender identity that matches the biological sex is also an idea here. And so I had a participant, she was 31 from Canada and a female, and she said, I am a woman, I assume myself as a woman, I don't want to be a man, I'm a woman and a man is a man. We assume the sex that we are. And if you look at the bottom, I have the original French that I had to transcribe. And so here she's essentially saying, and she went on to state that, she has very feminine behaviors. She likes to wear makeup, she likes to, talk with friends, and that doesn't really fit with the masculine style. The term gendered is 2 things for some people, masculine or feminine. And this person from Morocco, had that view, but Morocco is very much masculine and feminine country, so there's kind of some nuance there. Gender as a nuanced label, i.e. a spectrum. And so this is that idea that there's a spectrum. Gender is a term, it's more fluid, and therefore you can be any kind of percentage that you want. So you can be 20% female and the rest of a percent male, 0-0, that kind of thing. And it's basically shaped by specific characteristics and behaviors that we have in mannerisms. Discussion, the goals of the study, I achieved all 3 goals, but the one I want to focus on, I did identify current views of gender, the 2 that I discussed. My findings provide a foundation for further investigation into gender identity, gender stereotypes, and gender communication practices. And this was a pilot study essentially looking at gender, culture, and communication. Some limitations, I'll mention one for time's sake. I need a larger sample size. I did predominantly female, there was no male Canadian participants, and they weren't equal in size. Some people I would like to thank are the project advisor, Dr. Stacy Ayotte, Dr. Q, who's the Merit Director, the McNair Scholars Program, and then the Foreign Language Department at the University of Montevallo. And here are my references.
Hello everyone, I'm Kelly Sellers. My research, Speaking with Agency, Disabilities and Spaces in Sharon Draper's Out of My Mind, is a research I did alongside Dr. Cynthia Mwinja in the spring of 2016 and have since been published in Coplac's Metamorphosis. This research really helped me in my decision for graduate school because at the time I was still figuring all that out, but through the research I was able to learn so much about special education that I decided to come back to the University of Montevallo to achieve my alternative master's in collaborative or special education. In Sharon Draper's Out of My Mind, Melody is a 5th grader with cerebral palsy who cannot verbally communicate through speech. Throughout the text, she navigates the challenges she faces as she searches for her agency, a way to speak her mind to the people around her. Kenneth Burke's rhetorical theory of dramatism focuses on the concept of motives. Investigating characters' motives, whether it is Melody or characters around her, can be done by examining a scene through the elements of the pentad. By analyzing how dramatism can be applied to particular moments of Out of My Mind, we can see that not only looking at different characters' perspectives reveals different motives, but also how Melody, as a young adult character with a disability, interacts with the narrative spaces and the people within these spaces. The pentad's purpose is to dissect a particular moment within a text that distinguishes the motives between one's act. It also helps the reader to not only break down and identify the various aspects of the selected moment of who or what is factoring in as each role, but also to better understand the motive of the agent or agents involved and how this insight from the pentad contributes to the overall text. Burke defines each of the elements as following. The agent is what person or kind of person performed the act. The scene is the background of the act or the situation in which it occurred. The act names what took place in thought or in deed. The purpose is the why of an act, and the means is what means or instruments are used to commit an act. For this presentation, I will use Burke's pentad to investigate 2 scenes from the novel and explore how each element impacts the scene based on who the agent is. For the first scene, I chose a flashback from Melody's 3rd grade year in room H5, a special education classroom. I began to analyze this scene by placing her teacher, Miss Billups, as the agent, as noted in figure 2. While the scene is normally the space that the characters find themselves within, Miss Billups, however, views Melody and her classmates as part of the scenery rather than agents. She later tells Melody's mother that she believes, quoting from the novel, "These children need a constant review of the basics since they don't retain information like the rest of us." By using the phrases "these children" and "like the rest of us," Ms. Billups excludes the children and who she considers as the rest of us, perceiving the students more as objects within the scenery, or in other words, dehumanizing them because of their disabilities. Rather than being a place to learn and grow, the classroom serves as Ms. Billups' means to perform her act, imposing her vision and understanding of the students upon them. While she says her purpose is to approach each child with an open mind, her purpose is actually to not be influenced by other teachers, so she can carry out her act. By doing so, this defeats the whole purpose of having an open mind. Through examining Ms. Billups as the agent, we see how she views herself as helping her students by reviewing past concepts for them to learn new material. However, the pentad uncovers her true motives by analyzing her perception of the students, her logic behind her purpose, and her means of performing her acts. Later in the school year, Melody and her classmates find their agency within the classroom. Readers, looking at Melody and her classmates as co-agents, see how they react to Miss Phillips' vision of the classroom by causing an uproar within the scene. While Melody is not able to communicate through her thoughts and opinions verbally, she can make a lot of noise to express boredom and rebellion through one of her tornado explosions that involves flailing, jerking, and kicking, while her fellow classmates follow suit through their crying, hollering, and so forth. These acts confirm that the students see themselves as agents within the scene, not the scenery themselves. When the reader sees the students as agents rather than how Ms. Phillips sees them, they learn that students with disabilities are a part of the rest of us and should be included within a space, whether it be in a classroom or within society. Analyzing the students as co-agents show their motive, to express their feelings and concerns in a way that they are heard. This dramatistic analysis shows how the students do not define themselves by their disabilities, despite Ms. Phillips' act of inflicting her opposing perceptions on them. About midway through the novel, Melody receives a Medi-Talker, a communication device similar to the picture on the screen, for individuals with disabilities to use for verbal communication. This device has both pre-programmed phrases and responses, as well as a keyboard to type her own. The Medi-Talker is a tool for Melody to not only communicate, but also give her the agency she has been longing for since the start of the novel. As shown in Figure 2 and 3, the elements of the pentad can be rearranged to gain new insights about the scene. In my research, I completed a pentad analyzing the same scene I will be discussing momentarily with Melody's teammates as the co-agents. The scene is set in Mr. Deming's classroom with her teammates apologizing to Melody for causing her to miss the flight to the Whiz Kids National Competition, a Scholars Bowl-like competition, because they did not inform her about the unexpected flight change. However, for time, I will only focus on Melody as the agent in the scene, as shown in Figure 4. Unlike the pentad in Figure 2, Melody now has her Medi-Talker to verbally communicate to carry out her own sense of agency. As for her means, she shows this in a variety of ways. First, she drives her wheelchair into Mr. Deming's classroom herself. Normally, she has an aide to push her wheelchair from class to class. This shows that she has the boldness to face her teammates on her own despite what they did to her. Second, she initiates the discussion with her teammates through her Medi-Talker. Third, rather than being angry and spiteful with them, she turns down their offer of receiving the trophy and ends up leading the team in laughing at the trophy. Finally, just as she comes in, she drives herself out of the classroom once the matter is resolved. For Melody, her purpose is not to only resolve the conflict amongst her teammates, but also to prove to them that despite her disability, she has the ability to be the agent for herself with her motive to be able to speak her mind. While one's motive is positive or negative, everyone has a motive when performing an act, and repositioning the pentad on different agents reveals their motives. Melody strives towards her abilities despite her disability, and for the characters around Melody, the reader sees that while some remain set in their negative perceptions about individuals with disabilities, other characters are open to changing their perceptions that is geared towards inclusion because of Melody. Unfortunately, there will be some moments like in Out of My Mind where there are attempts at excluding individuals with disabilities, but being aware of those attempts of exclusion allows us to be advocates for inclusion and work together towards a solution. As a future educator, I hope to take what I learned from this research and Draper's novel, not to be the best, but to do my best to help each student reach their potential. Thank you.
Language is innovative. Some scholars would even say it shapes the way we perceive our socially constructed realities. Perceptions of gender are no different. We are seeing linguistic creativity in Francophone regions right now. Perceptions of gender are shifting, and linguistic adaptations are being made to create a more gender-inclusive and/or gender-neutral language. Hi, My name is Raina Verser, and I dedicated a semester to studying these linguistic adaptations. Today, I'm going to be covering my research. First, I'll introduce us with some contextual information, and then I will describe my research methodology, and finally, I will be describing the results. Let's start with the primary objectives of this study. So first, I want to note that the objective of this study was to analyze the relationship between the French language and gender. The first research question dealt with what specific actions that people in French-speaking regions are taking in order to create a more gender-inclusive style of speaking and writing. The second question dealt with how specifically French-speaking women and French-speaking gender nonconforming people have implications for these adaptations. First, let's talk about the masculine neutral. The masculine neutral has been problematized by groups in decades. First, let's talk about the three primary contexts in which it is used. First, it is used as a linguistic neuter. So, for instance, you may see that it is sometimes used masculine variants of terms in order to refer to more neutral things. So, for instance, you would use the word l'homme, the word for man, rather than humain, the word for human. And then let's talk about plural cases. So for instance, in mixed gender groups, you might find that the masculine variant of they, il, is used rather than the feminine variant, elle, or some other variation. Finally, we have professional titles. Job titles sometimes lack a traditional feminine variation in France. So for example, the words for engineer, doctor, professor traditionally lack feminine variations. The masculine neutral has been both opposed and defended by certain groups. So for instance, some French feminist groups contend that it perpetuates female erasure because it creates ambiguity as to the gender of the referent. And they also say that it equates maleness with humanness because sometimes we use masculine variants of terms to refer to neutral terms. Other people who defend the masculine neutral say that linguistic adaptations that are being made right now overcomplicate spoken and written French. They also claim that it over-politicizes what is purely a linguistic issue. L'écriture inclusive has emerged as an alternative to the masculine neutral. There are three primary principles that I want to cover here. First, using neutral terminology when possible. So to refer to our previous example, you might use the word humain as opposed to l'homme, the word for man, when you're referring to humans or mankind in general. Second, using the mid-dot or alternating generics in order to refer to a mixed gender group. So for instance, let's take the word for singer, chanteur. That's the masculine variation. If you were using the mid-dot, which looks like a period, you would say chanteur, mid-dot, euse, the feminine suffix, dot, s, in order to refer to a group in the plural. You might also use alternating generics. So for instance, chanteur et chanteuse. That way you're using both the masculine and feminine variations. Finally, you would want to use the gender-specific when possible. So for example, as opposed to when you're referring to a judge saying Madame le juge, notice the masculine le, you would say Madame la juge, notice the feminine la. Information on the ways these linguistic adaptations are affecting gender nonconforming, that is, trans and non-binary speakers, is limited at best. Hopefully we'll be seeing some more research in this area in the future. But for now, we are seeing some information and patterns in the data emerging. For example, Schroy notes that some new pronouns are emerging. For example, il. You'll notice that it sounds like the masculine variant, il, the word for he in French, but it differs in spelling. As opposed to il, the word for il, he, it is spelled iel. There's also use of the mid-dot when referring to someone in the singular. So for instance, to return to our example of the word for singer, chanteur, someone who is referring to themselves in the singular might say chanteur, mid-dot, euse. There's also the release of official forms relating to gender identity terms. So for instance, in the Government of Ontario, they released a recent document that has terms related to gender identity. So for instance, a genre, the word for agender, or non-binarité, the word for non-binary. As far as research methodology for the study, I used both quantitative and qualitative methods. First, I used quantitative methods. I had participants complete a demographic questionnaire and a Likert scale survey in order to assess eligibility for the study and to get their opinions on this topic before I followed up with a live interview. I conducted live interviews via video chat on the platform Talk Abroad, an online platform that allows you to speak with native speakers of certain languages. I chose French for obvious reasons, because I wanted to get a chance to speak with native French speakers from different countries. There were a total of 13 participants for this study. In order to be eligible for the study, you had to be at least 18 years of age, have lived in or are currently living in a Francophone region, and be fluent in spoken and written French. There was mixed gender of the group, but it was predominantly female, and participants hailed from Canada, France, Morocco, and Tunisia. As far as the results, some patterns emerged in the data. As far as linguistic adaptations that people are making most often, I noticed two primary strategies. First, suffixation. You'll notice here I have the words for professor and the feminine variation of professor. Like I said before, the word for professor traditionally lacks a feminine variation. So in order to feminize the term, people will sometimes add the letter E or another feminine suffix in order to make it a feminine variation. So for example, you notice le professeur, and then underneath that, la professeure with an E. There's also the use of neutral phrasing when possible. So for instance, to refer to our previous example that we've used before, the word humain as opposed to l'homme, or referring to whether the referent is male or female. You'll notice we're speaking in primarily binary terms with this, and I'll get to why we're doing that in a moment. This research has implications for both French-speaking women and for gender nonconforming French speakers. So for French-speaking women, let's refer to what participant C says. Participant C notes that there are many movements in France and other regions to stop the belief, for instance, that pink is for girls and blue is for boys, or princesses are for girls and trucks are for boys. This is a subversion of usual gender roles. In this way, these adaptations create a concrete basis for modern shifts in thought. They also increase the social visibility of women. Because you are describing whether or not the referent refers to someone who is male or female, you are reducing the ambiguity that is created by the masculine neutral. The masculine neutral doesn't make it clear whether or not a referent is male or female, whereas determining whether a referent is male or female does. I said that we're speaking in mostly binary terms because there is a cross-regional lack of awareness as to how these linguistic adaptations affect gender nonconforming speakers. The research hasn't yet reached that stage, and neither has it in many regions. You'll notice that participant H says that it hasn't reached that stage in their region. It's considered something that's mostly for women. Participant A also notes that in Canada, it's not necessarily a matter of mentality, but rather it's a matter of linguistic technique. There just aren't many words to describe the experiences of non-binary and trans speakers. Overall, we're seeing that linguistic adaptations don't stem from a single source. In fact, they are not even distributed evenly across regions. For example, France may be in one stage with these linguistic adaptations, coming up with official modifications for terms, while Canada may be in another stage, and Tunisia and Morocco may be in yet another stage. This research has implications not only for native French speakers, but also for those who teach French, because they are tasked with teaching a language as it evolves, and that can be a challenge. Overall, only time will tell how these languages will continue to evolve over time. How will these adaptations continue to affect French-speaking women and gender nonconforming speakers? How will they continue to change as we see the years go by? Well, only time will tell. Thank you.
Bye.